Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Luebke, Senior Fellow for the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation. Dr. Luebke's career has centered around questions of school choice and educational policy. Dr. Luebke, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
It's good to be here, Josh.
Well, I recently read your piece at the John Locke Foundation, an essay entitled Teacher Pay, a look at the last decade. I found your report absolutely fascinating. So I was hoping we could get together to talk about that. So I really appreciate you meeting with me to do that. So I've been teaching for the last 8 years, and teacher pay is a conversation that teachers never get tired of. We could talk about that all day, every day. Help us with kind of a survey about teacher pay. Has it remained stagnant or low in North Carolina, or has it changed? What should we know about teacher pay?
Well, Josh, it is the issue that never goes away, and there are many reasons for that. But anybody who's lived in North Carolina for the last 15 years realizes that teacher pay seems to be one of the top education issues every year. And if you actually dig down into the data over the last decade, what you see really is that teachers' salaries have actually improved considerably over the last decade. There's been room for improvement, but, through prudent policies and, with changes, in how we pay teachers, et cetera, teachers have actually experienced, increased salaries over the last decade. But if you look at just, say, since 2014, in that year, the average teacher salary was approximately $45,000. And if you look at 2020, 21, it's increased to about $54,400. So that's an increase of almost 21% over that time. Now, over the last 8 years, in 7 of those years, teachers actually received, pay raises ranging from, 1.2% to about 7%. But over that time period, the average increase is about 3.25%, which is significant, considering, all things, in that if you look at, the last 8 years, that has outstripped the consumer price index. So if you look closely at the last 8 years, teachers have made up ground. Now there has been, ground to make up, but if you look at salaries, if you look at absolute salaries with regards to cost of living, if you look at relative salaries with regards to other states in the Southeast and so forth, all of that has improved in the last 8 to 10 years. And that's a message that people really don't understand. But if you ask the average person on the street, how much the average teacher makes in North Carolina, that number will be inaccurate. I know over the last few years, the Civitas poll has actually done a number of questions on that, on how much they think average teachers make, and then what they feel they should be paid, and then what they're asking again, how much they actually make. And there's quite a divide between what people think teachers actually make and how much they actually make. So that disparity, I think, drives some of the myths. But when you dig down into the numbers over the last 8, 10 years, teachers have actually made out pretty well.
Well, that's really helpful. That's one of the reasons I want to talk with you today, because I've definitely been in conversations with fellow teachers where the perception is that North Carolina just doesn't pay teachers that well. And certainly and I know there are differences there between whether you're talking about private school teachers versus public school teachers. But the difference between perception and reality that you're describing is really, really interesting. Now, where do you think the inaccuracy in perception comes from? I mean, because I know teachers who, I mean, they made major life changes. I mean, in terms of like, I know a couple people who chose to move to Georgia because they said their cost of living was a little lower in Georgia and their salaries would be higher. And this just makes me kind of question that a little bit more. So where does that inaccuracy come from?
Well, I think there's been a steady drumbeat over the last 10 years by North Carolina Association of Educators, which is, the main teacher union organization here in North Carolina, which is a state affiliate of the National Education Association, which is the largest teachers union affiliate in the country. And, obviously one of their goals every year is to increase salaries. So they're constantly saying that, North Carolina or other states are below the national average. And we can get in how that's kind of a misleading statistic, but they use it every year. So the drumbeat that NCAE has contributed, to some of the misperception. And, in fairness, say from about 2010 to about 2014 or so, North Carolina was lagging, with relative, in a relative sense, in teachers' salary, relative to other states. We were in, the mid to low 40s as far as our ranking relative to all 50 states. But we've made considerable progress since then. We had that challenge, and we kind of stepped up to the challenge to pay teachers more because, there was a need to do that. In 2013, Governor McCrory increased, the starting salary for teachers. Then we made a number of changes as far as, teacher bonuses and collapsed some of the teacher schedules so that, their teachers can be, actually improve their salaries through other means other than just working their way through a salary schedule that's based on time. That's really some of the major problem that, we don't get into at all, discussing teacher salary. But underneath all of this, one of the factors that drives this continual perception that teachers are underpaid is in part driven by the fact that they're paid via a schedule that's based not on performance, but on time. And that's really out of touch with most other professions. And we believe at the Locke Foundation, and most other conservatives believe, that teachers really should be paid on job performance and not seat time. So trying to get a different way to assess that, trying to get rid of the teacher salary schedule, that's really been occupying some of our time here. And I think in the long run, that's a better way to pay teachers. And it'll alleviate, I think, some of the problems that drive this obsession with teacher salaries.
Well, that's really interesting. I'd love to hear a bit more about that. What kind of metrics would, if in some kind of future world, the governor were to call you and say, Dr. Luebke, design us a new system of how we pay public school educators in the state of North Carolina. What would you do? What kind of performance pieces would you be looking at to determine raises or staying at the same pay or so on? Like what kinds of pieces are those? Test scores? Are those end of year exams? Are those some other metric? What kind of performance pieces would you be looking at?
Well, a couple of things here. We already provide bonuses for principals, and I believe also superintendents whose students, exceed state goals. We already provide that, and that's great. But I think the fundamental difference that we would, implement is that we would make that decision a local one. Right now, the way the whole system is set up, it doesn't benefit teachers. It benefits teacher unions. It benefits NCAE. The really the best way to pay teachers is to have their employer, the one that knows their value, make that decision. Not have that decision based on a salary schedule. So one of the fundamental points we'd like to implement is to be able to make that decision a local one. Give a principal the opportunity to provide a salary to a teacher. They know best the strengths and the areas of improvement for teachers. They know them better than anyone else. In other businesses, that decision is made on a local level. Why shouldn't it be made? Why shouldn't it be the same way in education, where the people who know teachers and how they perform and their value are usually in the building? But in education, we don't do things that way. That decision to have pay based on, time in the classroom, et cetera, that benefits the teachers' unions. It doesn't benefit teachers. Oftentimes, teachers outperform where they are on a salary schedule, but they're limited to where they can be on a salary schedule as far as what they can get. So there are many injustices that flow from that, and I think its usefulness. I mean, it's really kind of eclipsed its usefulness as far as the salary schedule. There are a lot of problems with it as far as and that were highlighted, just a few years ago when we were taking a closer look at it. We also believe one of the fundamental things we found out is that it takes teachers too long to get up to, say, a livable salary, say, of about $50,000. A few years ago, that was almost 15 years.
Oh,
and that's
my
just
goodness.
too long. People become frustrated. They leave the field because of that. So, but that's essentially, the slope that was adopted by the salary schedule, and it's a problem. And not, as we know, other people, exceed where they are. Some people don't perform up to that level, and oftentimes, there might be a problem in that you might not be able to, move them into another slot because of salary schedules and so forth. But it's really I believe, a straitjacket for most school districts. And if we were really to improve, the ability as to how we pay teachers, we need to move away from a system like a teacher salary schedule and move to a system where those decisions are made by basically the principals in those buildings, because they know best how teachers are performing. Now, would they have to develop salary ranges and so forth? Yes, but that's easy enough to do. And the good thing about that is the reality is that that all school districts are in different labor markets. There's a different labor market, in Wake County than there is in Wilmington and so forth. And school districts adopt to that, but principals, who are responsible for faculty and so forth, they're the ones that really need to be on top of that. And I believe, they all have the wherewithal to be able to develop a schedule that pay people appropriately, that reward them for service and provide, the appropriate incentives to make sure that people are performing. Those decisions, I think, are best made and are more effective in the long run if those decisions are in the building and not predicated simply on some piece of paper.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking of my own experience teaching for Thales Academy. I mean, we've gone through various different management models. Some years were more centralized than others. And our most effective management model for the school, at least, is really that decentralized model where each campus administrator is able to make decisions. One of our pieces, as Thales prides itself as being one of our phrases is a school run like a business. And one of the run like a business parts is that We have a centralized human resources department that handles those kinds of things and sets salary schedules and everything, but it's also highly related to recommendations from each campus administrator. And I think a lot of what you're saying makes sense to me. I mean, in that the principals are the ones doing classroom observations. They are the ones who know their strong players and their weak players. And I mean, one of the other difficulties I think that a lot of people would have with at least the North Carolina or at least the Wake County salary schedule is the one I'm more familiar with. It's also tiered to academic degree. So there's a substantial boost if you get a master's degree. It doesn't go beyond a master's degree. They kind of stop there. But I mean, my goodness, 15 years. I mean, teaching's a great career for somebody who is right out of college. But I mean, you can't start a family on $36,000 a year as a starting salary. You can't you can't really pay the bills. It takes a long time and the longer it takes, the more you end up losing some of your best people to other fields, I would think.
Yeah, that's a reality, Josh. I mean, that's happening, and it needs to be corrected. I mean, the legislature tried to, change that a little bit a couple of years ago when they were tweaking some of the salaries early on in your career and tried to make it a little steeper so that it wouldn't take so long to get up to, say 50,000. Because it just takes too long. People get discouraged. They realize, I'm not going to be making a good wage, for 15 years, and they leave the field.
Yeah.
And, I think I don't know if it's improved. About 2-3 years ago, I heard the stat that, 3 to 5 years after the average education student leaves college, 50% of them are out of the classroom. And my guess is that, what I just said as far as, taking too long to get up to a livable wage is probably one of the reasons that, that's driving a lot of that.
Oh, I would certainly suspect. I'm sure that's true. I haven't looked at any recent data, and I've heard that same statistic. I know. I've also heard there's nationwide there is a shortage of teachers, and it's with the way we have kind of our society currently set up. Teaching is a necessity, but it's really difficult if we are not compensating teachers to really reflect that when the people who are going to be successful in the classroom typically have a skill set that means they could be successful in a variety of fields. I wonder if we could go back to something you mentioned a moment ago. You said that the North Carolina Association of Educators is our state's affiliate of the National Education Association. Could you tell us a bit about what exactly is the role of the teachers union in education? I mean, is this a necessary evil? Do they provide some kind of massive benefit in terms of quality assurance, or is really this a bane on education as a whole? What is your view of teachers unions?
Well, I think we have to get into what they view their mission as and actually what happens. And if you look at the NCA mission statement, they say they are a voice of educators in North Carolina, and they aim to unite, organize, and empower members to be advocates for education professionals, public education, and children. Okay, so that's pretty broad and expansive. But if you look at what actually happens, now let me back up a little and say they have every right to do that and be a professional organization for teachers. I'm not questioning that at all, as much as any other profession has a right to do that. Where we question is their continual stance that they are working in the best interests of children or parents, which I don't. I mean, I think many of their actions run against those claims that they're working in the best interests, of the public schools and the children. Every year I usually publish a lot of the resolutions that they've adopted at their annual convention, the annual NEA convention. And that'll come out probably in a week or two, because I actually think that they're at their national convention now. But What I try to highlight there is that politically and culturally, I think they're out of step with most of mainstream America. And unfortunately, over the last decade or so, I would say a lot of the NCAA teachers, have become pretty ardent social justice warriors and have used their teaching position, as a vehicle to bring a lot of politics into the classroom that most people object to. So that's been a significant source of disagreement and opposition that we've had with NCAE. Now, if you notice, they have led, those two efforts, the two marches the last couple of years, Red for Ed.
Yep, I remember that one.
Primarily political rallies, and they weren't shy about saying that they were political rallies, and they were trying to, use that as a mechanism for boosting their own membership and highlighting a lot of the things that they wanted to put on their education agenda, a lot of which, if you look closely, were not education related, such as, Medicaid expansion was one of the things that was on the NCAA agenda for, I think, 2 years ago at their last rally, and a number of other things that, the average person would question, what does this have to do with education? But it's just indicative of, a political agenda that's been seeping into the classroom and that a lot of people have problems with.
Now, is the one other question about the NEA or the NCA, NCAE, do those organizations, are those tied to licensure, meaning that are all licensed teachers members of that organization?
Are you talking about a license to teach in North Carolina?
Yeah, that's what I'm asking there. Like, are those? I guess what I'm trying to figure out is it optional to join those organizations, or is that really something that every teacher, as part of working in a public education space, is going to be a member of that organization?
No, you're not required. North Carolina does not require every teacher to join NCAE. In fact, we track their membership every year, and in fact, I just blogged on this about a week ago that NCAE has had I think it's the 9th or 10th consecutive year of declining membership. So they have been bleeding members for the last decade, which is a statement. Teachers vote with their feet. I mean, one thing I did want to say, if we're talking about this topic, as I said early on, they said that NCAA claims to be the voice of educators in North Carolina. The last membership number that was released for North Carolina was that they had about 17,000 active members in North Carolina. Now, active means teachers, instructional staff, or other professionals. Now, there's about 94,000 actual teachers, full-time teachers in North Carolina. So, depending upon how many of those 17,000 are teachers, and if, say for the sake of argument, you said all 17,000 were teachers, that would mean that about 18% of current North Carolina teachers were members of NCAE. Another way, that's another way of saying, less than 1 in 5, or 4 out of 5 teachers approximately are not members of NCAE. Now that puts the question in a different light for most people, because I think a lot of people around North Carolina think that most every teacher is a member of NCAE. And that's certainly not the case if you look at these numbers. As I said before, the number of teachers in NCAE has been declining, precipitously over the last 10 years. And I've written on that. You can look up those articles on johnlocke.org. I have, and Terry Stoops, my colleague, usually write about this at least once or twice a year, the declining membership. The other thing that's kind of interesting also is, and I think this bears on, the general topic of teacher salaries. Everyone remembers the last two marches, the Red for Ed marches in Raleigh. I think it was in 2018 and 2016. And those were, demonstrations, obviously, to show dissatisfaction with, teacher salaries and with some ed policy that was being developed. And also, and they weren't, leaders in the organization weren't shy about saying there were also political rallies and also tools to boost NCAA membership. But what's interesting, even though there were, by some reports, anywhere from, 10 to 15, 16,000 people at these rallies, if you look at membership numbers, the organization received no bump or increase in membership during those years. That's significant. Considering all the publicity and all the notoriety that those events had, the organization really did not, achieve that goal of kind of reversing the trend of declining enrollment. That's noteworthy.
That is really interesting. It reminds me of Ronald Reagan's famous phrase, the silent majority of Americans who would vote, even they might not go to a rally, but they would vote for their conscience. It seems like there is a silent majority of North Carolina teachers that don't value the kinds of principles, at least certainly don't value them enough to join the teachers union and be a part of that. What you were describing about those low numbers, that 18% of teachers, and I wonder if that correlates with a sort of leftward movement of the NCEA. On another episode in this season on the show, Dr. Richard Vedder has a great description of the closing of Mills College and connecting that to really Mills College going so progressive that they no longer provide education to students. And so there is a sharp market response where when they no longer provide the service for which their organization exists, people don't show up and pay tuition. And so it seems to me those numbers definitely reveal a disconnect between the actual actions and values of the North Carolina Association of Educators and the values teachers hold dear.
Yeah, I think that's an astute observation, Josh. And I think that the other factor that we need to bring into play here is just, how school choice has been brought into this whole discussion. And, parents are not happy with how their schools are being politicized. And over the last year, the pandemic, has highlighted, how parents want more educational options. But I think even in coming back to school and, just the realities of, different political indoctrination in schools and, how parents are, they don't want to send their child to a school whose values or whose instructional practices undermine their own. They want to send their child to a school that affirms their own values, is a safe environment, and can challenge their children academically. And if they don't find that, where their child is currently going, parents will move. They vote with their feet. And we can see the recent, uptick in school choice, as a result of that. And parents, over the last year, primarily driven by the pandemic, parents want options, and I think those options are driven, in part by, some of the political wins and how certain groups view education and how certain groups want to use education as a vehicle to other ends. And parents don't like it. and they want other options. And I think a lot of that's being worked out in the market now.
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. There was a fascinating article in the Manhattan Institute's journal, City Journal, a few months back about social justice ideology being openly taught and not by kind of a fringe teacher or two, but really institutionalized in Wake County public professional development instruction for their teachers. That really the idea of white guilt and white fragility was being institutionalized in Wake County. That shocked a lot of parents, I think, and really I've seen several pieces over the last few months about parents now seeing a lot of the work that their students are being assigned with virtual education and being very unhappy. Thales Academy, and I assume many other places as well, has seen enrollment skyrocket in the past year because parents realize they want something different. When given a choice, parents, I don't want to sound like I'm saying all parents are truly conservative. I don't think that's the case either. I think parents really want their kids to get a great education. They want their kids to have lots of opportunity going forward. But what they don't want is their children to be indoctrinated one way or the other. They want their children to be given the best of critical thinking skills so that they're able to pursue whatever opportunities life brings them. And if that's not happening in a school, I think you're absolutely right. Parents will vote with their feet and they will go where they need to be to help their children have those opportunities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. There's a lot going on in Wake County right now, and you know, I do remember seeing that piece they referred to in City Journal, and I think that was somewhat one of the initial sparks that you know, started a lot of this parent uprising. I know there's a group in the county that has 5,000-6,000 parents in it. You know, that was initially started, you know, with the goal of reopening Wake County schools. But because, you know, the parents are also concerned with not only issues of being open, you know, an issue that, you know, was prominent during the pandemic, but, you know, parents don't like a lot of things that are going on in the schools. And one of those, I mean, you don't have to be, you know, conservative or liberal. I mean, when you get the sense that, I think you get a sense in most schools within a couple days of whether or not parents are part of the equation and really welcome in schools. And I think one of the things that's driving, I mean, these changes and, you know, the popularity of school choices, unfortunately, a lot of these schools don't look at parents as, you know, a really important part of a child's education development, but they view them as they're in the way in trying. They're an enemy to, you know, really having the school accomplish a lot of the goals that they want, and that parents are not an important part, you know, in their child's development, and they just assume, you know, work around them. That's bad. That is not, you know, a formula for any success for children. Parents do not respond to that. They will move to other alternatives as they should. And I think a lot of that's working out right now as you see movement from, you know, either publics to charters to privates, you know, to homeschool to virtual school. I think you're right when you said when you said during the pandemic, you know, a lot of these things came to light. What was going on in the classroom, how instruction, you know, was being taught, and you know, parents I think got kind of a view behind the curtain on some of this, and they really didn't like a lot what they saw. And I mean, and that's, you know, how can we do something better is, you know, is a question I think a lot of them are looking at right now.
Well, Dr. Luebke, I wonder if we could circle this conversation back around and see if we can connect a couple things we've been talking about. So help me if going back to the article I read that started this whole conversation. If I understood you correctly, you see a connection between the way the National Education Association reports teacher salaries and the creation of the sort of myth that we talked about earlier about like that this is part of how people get the impression that their state either pays teachers really well or very poorly. And that really how that information is reported changes a lot based on whether we include certain factors. Did I understand your argument correctly?
Yeah, that's very true, Josh. And most reporters, when they report on this, they're not going to include, these factors that really influence, the rankings. And what we're talking about is every year, the National Education Association has a state rankings, of teacher salaries in every state. It's self-reported data, but it's average teacher salary along with other education, instructional support jobs and, statistics along those lines. But the key ingredient here is that there are some problems that kind of drive the story that they want. And one of them is that they use an average salary, which kind of is an easy way for them to get their point across. Now, anyone, stay with me a minute here. They're ranking 50 states, that have different teaching workforces, different ages, different levels of unionization. Some don't have, unions, or in some areas unions aren't very strong. They have different ages of workforce, different ways schools are financed. A whole lot of different factors play into this. But we lock them all into one category. And what happens year after year after year is certain states, California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, high unionized states come out on top, for obvious reasons. And the majority of other states are lower. Well, and then they say, so-and-so state is, underneath the national average. Well, most people would think, okay, the average is in the middle. But because the states that I described on the high end, they're so much higher, they skew the average. They skew it high. So that in actuality, if you're ranking 50 states, and this has happened, I've tracked this. I think last year, I don't know if it happened this year, but this past year, 38 out of the 50 states were underneath the national average. Now, that doesn't sound right, does it?
38 out of 50 were below the average.
Yeah, it skews higher. In other words, if you have, let me try to simplify. If you have 10 people, 10 teachers, and say 2 or 3 of them are making $150,000, and the other, 7 are making $35,000 or $40,000. That's going to skew the average teacher salary considerably higher, right?
Sure.
It's going to go up, even though it's an average. But even though the majority of teachers in that classroom, are going to be way below the national average because it's skewed. So in the same sense, nationally, if you take the same principle, 38 out of 50 states are below the national average. Well, that's to their benefit. Why? Because their goal is to get the national average up. Now, the proper statistic, if you're talking about the actual average, which when people say that, they usually mean the middle, right? Mm-hmm. The proper statistic that we should be using in this discussion is really the median, which is a true middle. The average is influenced too much by high or inordinately high salaries or inordinately atypical numbers. And they can be skewed, and in this case, they are. But they do that because it makes their case. Now, that's a shortcoming. It's a significant shortcoming, but it works to the union's benefit. But nobody ever talks about it because reporters don't want to, delve into it, but they're using the wrong statistic. Another shortcoming of the NEA salary rankings that never gets talked about is that the numbers do not include cost of living. Like North Carolina, they'll say, well, your teachers' salaries here are lower. They're not as high as New York and New Jersey. Well, the fact of the matter is the cost of living up there is considerably higher. So you would expect teacher pay to be higher up there. And that's a shortcoming. Now, even within North Carolina, and this gets back to what I was talking about before, about regional labor markets, even within North Carolina, there are differences in cost of living. In some sense, local school districts have what are called local salary supplements to help school districts, reconcile or, accommodate differences, between, urban areas. Like it's going to be more expensive, in Wake County or Charlotte than it would be, in rural areas, either, like in Murphy or, some other rural area that, is not generally doesn't have a higher cost of living. So, we even recognize that even on a state level. So, but when you totally ignore that on a national level, I think it really limits the validity of your findings. And that's been a common criticism. My colleague Terry Stoops here at the Locke Foundation has actually done a fairly good job. Most years he's done this where he'll take, what the actual NEA rankings is as far as North Carolina, and then he will apply cost of living data to it. I think the most recent one I saw was 2019. I don't think he did it for the pandemic because the numbers were way off.
Sure.
But in 2019, North Carolina ranked 34th nationally in the NEA data. But when you applied cost of living data to it, North Carolina's ranking actually went down to 29.
Oh.
So when you factor that in, and because every salary has context. $60,000, in Raleigh, is worth much more than $60,000, in Chicago. But the NEA salary data does not take any of those factors, any of those cost differences into consideration. As I said before, when Terry did that, and in most cases, I think, in all the cases when he's done it, North Carolina's position, its relative ranking has improved. So when anyone reads these articles in the newspaper, and they're usually printed in the spring because that's when the survey is released. Just make sure people understand that the survey results do not include cost of living differences. Then lastly, another thing that readers should be aware of that's a potential shortcoming is that these surveys do not take into account differences in the composition of the teaching force from state to state. For example, let's compare just New York and, say, North Carolina. New York has an aging population. It has a stronger union workforce. And their average teacher is much older than the average age of a teacher in North Carolina. North Carolina is a growing state. They've had to build more schools. They've had to hire more teachers. The average age of a teacher in North Carolina is much less, than what it is in North Carolina. So that obviously the average age or the average teacher pay, in a state that has younger teachers is going to be lower. I mean, that's just the reality based on the demographics of the teaching workforce. But again, you know, the survey does not account for any of those differences, but it really impacts, you know, the final number, and those figures really need to be addressed, or those factors need to be addressed, you know, to help explain, you know, why a state's average salary is what it is. But those are things that we consider, you know, to be shortcomings. No survey or no study like that is perfect. You all have shortcomings, but I think when, you know, the findings are discussed, I think they really, people need to understand that there are important factors, you know, that need to be brought into the discussion of the findings, you know, and that cost of living is not included. And that's one of the major ones, or the composition of the teacher workforce.
Sure.
You know, those are factors that really, you know, significantly impact where a state's going to fall on a relative ranking.
Those are some really helpful nuances for us to consider, Dr. Luebke. I think I frequently tell my debate students, I coach our debate team at Thales Rollsville, and I frequently tell them that if they're going to cite information in a case from a study, they need to be ready to explain why that data is legitimate and why it has not been manipulated. Because everything you're describing sounds to me like a whole bunch of data that, if it's arranged this way, information comes out favoring a certain group. If it's arranged another way, it comes out favoring somebody else. But then what we end up with is sort of a grab bag of factual claims that journalists can quickly get, and they can attribute to a very legitimate sounding organization that the news reading public can then hear, and it sounds legit. But when you dig in a little bit deeper, there's a lot more under the surface. So I really appreciate you giving us that under the surface look at it. Well, we're running up on our time for today's conversation. Here on the Optimistic Curmudgeon, we're always looking for really two things. You've helped us enormously with an area where it seems that kind of what everyone knows is in fact wrong. Where if what we know is that teacher pay is horrendously low in North Carolina, you've already given us a lot more to the story. There's more to that claim. There's more to know than just that factoid that it seems like we all know. But the other thing we're always looking for too is those pieces of hope of where we see things going forward from here. So as we wrap up today, what changes do you think our state legislature could make that would improve public education in North Carolina?
Well, changes that it could make, I think there are a number of areas. Obviously, I think the major concern this past year has been the pandemic and making sure that kids are performing, you know, at the level they need to be is a great concern, and legitimately so. You know, that the last year has been really hard academically on kids. And as they get back to school, there has to be assessments to figure out where kids are at. And, you know, once they learn that, once they find that out, how best, you know, do you get kids to the level where they need to be performing? The legislature has, you know, taken a number of steps to address some of those concerns. There are summer camps, which I think are helpful. One of the things that we've been working hard towards is to provide parents, you know, grants or basically education savings accounts to allow them to use that money on expenses, you know, towards you know, academic assessment of their children. In other words, they could use that money, you know, for tutoring, you know, for you know, academic sessions, you know, whether the cost of, you know, a remedial program, for books, testing, things like that. There are a number of states that have already done this and have experimented with programs that have been proven to be exceptionally popular with parents. And I think if North Carolina went that way, it empowered parents really to take greater control over their child's education, and especially now in making sure that children are where they're supposed to be academically. I think that would be a real major step, in improving the education of children, but also improving public policy here in North Carolina. I know we've been working hard towards that. There are other groups that are working hard towards that. But I believe one of the bright spots, over the last year is as we've battled this pandemic, has just been the growing opportunities for school choice here in North Carolina. And I think to the extent that that flourishes, it provides opportunities for parents to put their child in the best educational environment, an educational environment that suits them, their strengths and their needs. And when that happens more, I think everyone wins. The child wins, the parent wins. I think we all win because when there's a good fit there, there'll be a good educational experience for children.
Well, Dr. Luebke, thank you so much for joining us today on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. Where can people find and follow your work online?
Yeah, I'm posting all my articles and all blog posts on our John Locke website, which is www.johnlocke.org. You can find all my writings there.
Perfect. We'll be sure to link that to our show notes. That listeners, you can find those show notes posted to optimisticcurmudgeon.org. Well, thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. You've been listening to another conversation on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you like what you've heard today, please leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcasting platform. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at optimisticcurmudgeon2021@gmail.com. You can find us on all major social media sites. I'll list 3. We're on Twitter at OptimisticC3, on Instagram at OptimisticCurmudgeon2021, and Facebook at facebook.com/the-optimistic-curmudgeon. You can find our show notes, guest bios, and all episodes stored on our website, optimisticcurmudgeon.org. Until next time, seek the good, love the true, and pursue the beautiful.